Okay, so I hope it's okay to just start off by saying that I have two kind of jobs. One, I'm very lucky to work part-time for the Mindfulness in Schools project as Pathways Manager. And the other work that I do is looking at how I support schools in terms of implementing wellbeing in the broadest sense. So just for this discussion that Adrian and I are having, I'm going to take off my Miss Pat and have my sort of wellbeing more broadly hat on. So I hope that's okay. So perhaps we should start off, Adrian, by just having a little bit of a chat about kind of how we see things at the moment in terms of wellbeing and education, at least in the UK.
Yeah, so there is more and more research being done into the mental health and wellbeing of students in the UK and also teaching staff, which I think is really valuable because you know, we can talk anecdotally about our experiences, which is useful, but you know, having hard empirical evidence just really helps us get a really clear picture of how things are, and equally if we're changing things to see if there's been any improvements. And yeah, some of the key pieces of research out there at the moment, I think since about 2018, the Teacher Wellbeing Index by the charity Education Support has been published, surveys thousands of education professionals in the UK. And yeah, we can see that generally speaking, the mental health and wellbeing of education professionals in the UK is not great. I think the latest, I think you know more about this than me in terms of the most recent report, but one statistic I think that stands out is something like 72% of staff report feeling stressed.
Yeah, 72% of staff and 84% of senior leaders.
Yeah, and similar, you know, there was a report by Professor Tamsin Ford, or research by Professor Tamsin Ford, showing that I think it was primary school teachers, about 1 in 10 primary school teachers can be diagnosed with clinical depression. And there's something, I was listening to a webinar of hers recently, and she was saying we need to be aware of something called burnout cascade, which is essentially that the mental health well-being of teachers feeds down into the pupils, and that, you know, it will start by, if the mental health and well-being of teaching staff is not great, then that's going to affect the classroom climate. And we heard earlier how important school and classroom climate is. And that then has an impact on behaviour. You start to notice behaviour starts to deteriorate, and it kind of creates this vicious circle. And then that has a negative impact on pupil outcomes. And then what you might find with this burnout cascade research is that teachers start to become more cold and callous, like they start to care less. And that's like a really toxic environment. So it is really important that we take this seriously, that there is a worsening effect on teachers and education professionals' mental health and well-being. So we do need to address this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was having a look at some of the data and can see that 40% of teachers have said that organisational culture has a negative impact on their wellbeing. So that really does speak to that idea of the climate being really important. But also, you know, in terms of young people, the most recent data has been in the COVID-19 surveillance report, which has shown a kind of worsening picture for some young people through the last couple of years, and in particular, children and young people who are already disadvantaged, as well as girls and older teens. And I guess to some extent, we won't know the full extent of all of this until we're a bit further down the line. But so it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. It's been mentioned already earlier today, but the Times Education Commission report has suggested in their 12-point plan that wellbeing is at the heart of education moving forward. And interestingly, that Ofsted needs to be reformed and to have a kind of wider remit, including looking at wellbeing and school culture, inclusion, etc.
Yeah, there's a paradox with Ofsted looking at well-being, which is, you know, according to many teachers and school leaders, often they would cite Ofsted as being, a cause of the hyper accountability that exists that is detrimental to mental health and well-being. The number of and the changing frameworks, and suddenly it's like, okay, this isn't important now, it's about curriculum, and suddenly there's a whole load of work that goes into curriculum, and then it's actually, this is important. And I agree, Ofsted should be looking at, and in fact I've gone through a recent Ofsted inspection as a school governor, and I'm the wellbeing lead governor at the school, and so when they were having the meeting with governors, I was very clear that I wanted to present our staff and wellbeing data, because we measure wellbeing in our school. And to be fair to Ofsted at the time, they did ask a lot of questions about what we have in place in the school to look after our senior leaders' mental health and wellbeing and our teaching staff's wellbeing. So I do think there's some positive shifts happening. I think part of that reform of Ofsted has to be that it's a more supportive organisation rather than just a judgmental one. Like there's not much benefit to saying you are good, you are outstanding, you are requires improvement if there isn't the support to improve and make things even better for students and teachers.
Yeah, you sort of remind me, I've done quite a lot of work where I've delivered mindfulness in education training overseas, and on some of our visits we've gone into schools, and I had, you saying that's really made me think about it. I had a situation where I was in a classroom watching a Spanish head teacher working with a class of children, and then suddenly someone came into the room and they were kind of like hugging and kissing and things, and he said, "This is my inspector." And we were kind of like, suddenly they're going, "Oh, okay, the inspector." And when we went out into, myself and all of these other teachers went out into the corridor, and we were asking the inspector questions. We said, "What's your role then with the head teacher of this school?" And he said, "My role is to support. I bring in all the expertise that I have to really help him sort of like do the best he can for his students." So I just agree. I think a support role, actually within that document, within the report, it says to move away from a climate of fear. So there is something about changing the nature, perhaps, of the way that inspection happens, which might be really helpful for everybody's well-being.
Definitely.
Yeah. So one of the things I was really curious about was to see whether what was going on at the moment in terms of wellbeing in schools with teachers and students was just to do with the pandemic. And the data shows actually that things were quite difficult beforehand. So the Teacher Wellbeing Index for 2019 is really similar to the one for 2021. And what the PISA reporting has shown around wellbeing for young people is that it's been gradually decreasing in the UK over the last 5 years. It's got particularly worse, so not necessarily pandemic related. So I think, and again, it might be that we see more sort of in the future around kind of what's happened as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, there is some data around pupil well-being that shows that the pandemic has kind of exacerbated things. So pre-pandemic, 1 in 9 children, this is kind of 5 to 18-year-olds, had a diagnosable mental health condition, and now it's 1 in 6 has a probable mental health condition. So that's quite a significant shift, and we know that it's children from disadvantaged families and backgrounds that have been most badly affected by the pandemic. And now we're coming out of the worst of the pandemic, we're moving into a cost of living crisis, and again it's going to be disadvantaged children and their families that are going to be most adversely affected. So yeah, just as we're hopefully getting through the worst of the pandemic, other things are happening which are going to affect people in different ways.
I was having a look at what some of the recommendations have been for how sort of teacher wellbeing and student wellbeing could be improved. And there was some really interesting, because we'll move into sort of how mindfulness might support this in a second, but some really interesting suggestions. There seems to be a definite kind of move towards things being more sort of collegiate, collaborative, that teachers work in teams collaboratively was kind of one of the suggestions that the Teacher Development Trust has made, that teachers feel more involved in whole decision making, whole school decision making. There's a real emphasis on positive relationships. And I was listening to what Kadra said, and also, you know, Jamie as well, about connection and belonging. And how important that is, not just for young people actually, but also for teachers. I remember it myself when I first started out in teaching, how much I just wanted to be, you know, part of the fabric of the school, and how it takes a little bit of time to kind of settle in. But how important that is in terms of feeling connected with your work, you know, and really feeling part of a community of people sort of working together productively and supportively.
Mm.
Also mentioned was creating a culture of mutual trust and having a sense of shared mission. So that was for teachers. And the Teacher Wellbeing Index says that educator mental health needs to be at the heart of any educational recovery. And then for students, again, this emphasis on inclusive whole school wellbeing approach, positive relationships, and encouraging a sense of belonging and connection for young people. So just really interesting to hear the crossovers as well between the two.
Yeah, we know from like really extensive research into well-being, like one of the pretty much the number one factor that affects our health and well-being the most is our experience of positive relationships. And in fact, you know, researching for this kind of discussion, one of the largest ever, if not the largest ever, surveys into workplace well-being carried out by the Oxford University Wellbeing Research Centre showed that a sense of belonging trumps pay in terms of workplace well-being. That sense of, like you've just said, connection, feeling connected to your colleagues, feeling like you're working together with a shared sense of purpose, feeling like you're part of a kind of team community. Every time it trumps, you know, pay, bonuses, anything like that, because that's essentially who we are as a species. We're part of a tribal species. Essentially, we need those connections, that sense of belonging, in order to kind of feel good and function well. And it's no different in schools. We need that connection and sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think sometimes, because I'm a secondary trained teacher, I know you're primary, I sometimes think that is easier in primary than secondary, just because the communities are smaller generally, and so there's more work to be done, I think, around how to implement that in secondary.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I was thinking about kind of, you know, like mindfulness in the context of kind of other wellbeing modalities, and, you know, how that might sort of support some of these recommendations that have been made. And I was thinking, we had a conversation, obviously we've had some conversations in the run up to this, and one of the things that you sort of mentioned was the fact that, you know, it takes one person to change themselves in order to change, you know, things in the outer world. And that really struck me. Yeah,
there's ironically a TomTom advert that I like to refer to if I'm, you know, giving talks to teachers, and the TomTom advert says, "You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic." And I think what I really like about that is that really just makes you realize, what role are you playing in this problem? So when I have moaned about the education system, you know, I am part of the education system. I think there are something like 650,000 teachers in the UK. That's way bigger than the DFE or the number of employees at Ofsted. So yeah, when I use that kind of TomTom advert, what I'm saying is, if we start to change individually, do that kind of self-care, that self-work, if we start to change what we focus on, what we value, what we agreed to do in schools, and what we say, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. When we start to change and we bring our colleagues with us, slowly but surely, I believe the system starts to change, because essentially we are part of the system. So yeah, I do think it starts with ourselves first, and then we kind of work out from there. We start with ourselves, we start in our classrooms, and then kind of spread outwards.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I find most helpful about mindfulness as a practice, is that you know, it has the fact that it is a practice, that we're sort of embodying it, it comes into our lives. It affects the way that we relate to ourselves, you know, to each other, to the outer world, as we were just exploring there in Jamie's talk about how we connect with the climate as well. And it's that capacity for us as teachers actually to walk our talk in that respect. So maybe some embodiment of the, you know, attitudes, the foundations within mindfulness that can make a real difference. And there was some research done in 2013 that showed that just teachers learning mindfulness had an impact on the behaviours of students in the classroom. And that then makes me think about the fact that young people often don't necessarily listen to what we say, but they take in how we are, you know, and that has real power. So how we are and how we're relating to them makes the real difference in terms of whether or not they think that they would like to also follow what we're modelling.
Yeah, there's a book called The Gardener and the Carpenter by Professor Alison Gopnik, child developmental psychologist, and she says that children learn far more from their caregivers' unconscious behaviours than any of their conscious manipulations. And this book is about being a parent, but you know, I read that book as with my parent hat on, but also my teacher hat on, and it's no different in the classroom. And there's the Claire Kelly quote that I read in a newspaper article where she was saying, you know, teachers can teach a wonderful mindfulness lesson, but the pupils will notice if you go out into the corridor and kick the photocopier when it's not working. It's that kind of, you know, practice what you preach, walk the walk, because that's what's going to have the biggest impact. So you're right. If teachers teach no mindfulness directly, but they are being more mindful, that will have a profound impact, I think, on themselves and the students they teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was thinking, because obviously there's the benefits to kind of for ourselves, for our own practice as well, in terms of our own well-being as teachers, in terms of sort of working more skillfully, helpfully for ourselves with, you know, challenge and difficulty. And then also, you know, that kind of impact that can have on the relationships that we have with young people when we're just present, when we fully show up, you know, in our roles with what we're doing. I noticed a difference myself because I was a teacher before I learned mindfulness. And I personally noticed that difference, even though I thought I was really present and available to the young people that I worked with. It was only after I developed a practice that I realised that I wasn't always. And what a difference it made when I really showed up and I was able to really hear what they were saying to me and really respond in the moment to what was coming. So yeah, really helpful. I wonder if I could just kind of move on to sort of looking at mindfulness and how it sits within sort of wider well-being in school in terms of teaching other things. One of the, I was part of the Healthy Minds project. I was in one of the schools that was involved in that. And we had a really interesting noticing, which was that we taught Breathe, which is the mindfulness programme, after we taught the Pen Resiliency programme. And one of the things I'd wondered was whether or not young people would find it easier to identify thoughts that were helpful or not better after they'd learned mindfulness. And so the following year, because we wanted to keep, it wasn't the part that was going through the research, but we decided to offer it the following year, and we did it the other way around. And we noticed that children were more able to access metacognition. So they were more able to kind of identify thinking, which was really helpful then for kind of the resilience learning that they were doing. And that's one of my thoughts, is that actually mindfulness really woven through really supports the learning of other wellbeing modalities. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I was teaching, so I teach Pause B in my junior school, and I'm currently covering year 6, who I taught Pause B to when they were in year 5, beginning of year 5. So I've kind of got them back. I'm covering their PPA or their teachers' PPA sessions, and we just did literally on Thursday just a lesson over kind of loci of control. So circle in the middle, things I can control, outside things I can't control. And we were just having a discussion, and really the focus was meant to be about transition, like moving to their secondary school, what things can they control, what things can't they control. And you know what, just one thing that I was so just impressed with was the depth of their just wisdom. Like, you know, someone said, I can't control things. We can't control is emotions, feelings. And then other people very respectfully disagreed. Well, actually, we can control them. And then we decided through discussion that maybe emotions, feelings should be across. They should kind of be things I can control and things I can't. And we had a discussion about the prefrontal cortex, which we learned in year 5, and how, you know, that doesn't fully develop until maybe we're around 24 years old. So actually, some emotions when we're 10, 11 are going to feel so big we can't control them. But as we get old, you know, it was such a rich discussion. And I do feel like a lot of their wisdom and a lot of their framing it, talking about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, definitely came from our Pause B lessons like a year ago. So yeah, I do find that when you teach the skills of mindfulness and you give them the language and you give them just that, you're just planting those seeds, it definitely kind of ferments and grows. And yeah, I was just really impressed, because it's literally been a whole year since I taught them, and it's still kind of there in the forefront of their mind. But yeah, much deeper and richer discussions were had this year compared to last.
Yeah, that's so good to hear, and actually really sort of makes me think about embedding and how we keep it alive, you know, as we kind of go through the school years. And so if we're teaching other wellbeing modalities, connecting it with it as well is helpful, maybe in a conscious way in our part as teachers, as well as, you know, the fact that they've naturally brought that through as well for you when you were talking about it. Yeah. So the other thing that I was thinking about was kind of organisationally, this whole school approaches to wellbeing that's been sort of recommended. And I was thinking about the fact that actually wellbeing is not just about teaching wellbeing modalities, and mindfulness, of course, is a really valuable part of, you know, a lot of other things like, you know, resilience teaching, compassion, gratitude, all of those things, growth mindsets, all of those are kind of can work together. But actually there's something about just looking at an organisation as well and how it operates, and making sure that it has got the heart, you know, at its heart, the wellbeing of staff and students. So just thinking about the infrastructure and the way that it kind of, you know, does performance reviews, or, you know, the way that we communicate with young people about exams, all of those things need to be kind of thought through, I think, in terms of wellbeing at a kind of a much deeper level in terms of the whole organisation.
Yeah, I generally think there should just be a more mindful approach to education, and, you know, a whole school approach to wellbeing in my mind is just a more mindful approach to wellbeing. So it's being more mindful, to me, is about slowing down. It's about noticing more, like you've been saying. It's about reducing this culture of busyness that every school I've worked in, there's just a culture of busyness. It's about stepping back. It's about seeing the bigger picture. It's about reflecting what really matters, what we spend our precious time on. It's about, you know, bringing to mind the impermanence, that, you know, this isn't going to last forever. Even if we're going through, you know, like COVID, teaching during the pandemic was really tough for many people. But even bringing to mind impermanence helps you deal with that challenging time. This isn't going to be like this forever. We can ride these waves and kind of come through the other side. Yeah, I just think a more mindful approach to well-being, you can scrap any kind of framework. If we are just more mindful, the way we approach the curriculum, the timetable, our interactions with parents, communication, I think it's just going to massively improve how we experience school, both teaching in it and being taught in a school.
I think that kind of one of the key things I think that's really on top for me is that mindfulness needs to always be invitational for it to be the most supportive it can possibly be. And what you've just named there about some of the ways in which kind of the school day, for example, could be easy, you know, if we have pauses, if we have reflection time, things like that. You don't necessarily need to have done a mindfulness course for that to be implemented within school. And I think that's really useful, actually, to kind of think about that, a mindful approach, as opposed to necessarily having to have everybody on the school staff practicing mindfulness through having done a course. So there's kind of that. And then there's also the fact that every school is completely different and unique. And so they will already have their own strengths that need to be played to. And there's something about kind of mindfulness and its responsiveness, in the sense of really kind of making sure as well that there's a sense of making your own way with it, not necessarily, there being a one size fits all. There's this real sense of kind of like, how do we make this our own? How do we help, mindfulness practice or a mindfulness approach kind of be here supporting us, and the way that we operate as an organisation. So I think both of those things are really key.
Definitely. I just want to give on that note one last shout out. Jamie mentioned it in his talk, implementing mindfulness in schools, an evidence-based guide that Professor Catherine Weir and I co-wrote. And there's loads of case studies in there, and we reached out to many different schools, special schools, maintained schools, private schools, primary, secondary, just to show that actually this can work in any context with the right implementation. And meeting schools and staff and pupils where they are, rather than just trying to force this one size fits all model.
Yeah, exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you both so much.